Have you ever wondered what Dream of the Red Chamber would be like without Lin Daiyu? For many of us, the thought seems completely absurd. She is such an integral part of the story that her absence would completely change everything. Actually, in a way, Lin Daiyu plays the role of a third wheel in this story. Now, most people don't talk about it like that, and most people probably don't think about her like that. But think about it this way. If you took Lin Daiyu out of Dream of the Red Chamber, the book turns into a conventional love story between Jia Baoyu and Shui Baochai. Well, this is obvious during an early scene where Jia Baoyu visits Shui Baochai. He discovers that the inscription on his jade piece perfectly matches an inscription on her necklace. And Shui Baochai's maid tells Jia Baoyu that she received that necklace mysteriously from a monk. This adds to this feeling that their relationship is a cosmic inevitability. So in the scholarly world, over the years, the decades, and the centuries, there's actually been a lot of speculation as to why Shui Baochai's necklace is such a good match to Jia Baoyu's jade. So perhaps this is some sort of insidious plot to try to force the two of them to be together. However, I do think that there's a much more simple answer, and I think that we can see this answer when we look at how Jia Baoyu reacts when he first meets Lin Daiyu. When he first meets Lin Daiyu, Jia Baoyu feels upset when he discovers that she doesn't have a piece of jade of her own. In fact, he becomes so upset that he throws his jade onto the ground and tries to smash it. Jia Baoyu's reasoning is that the jade is completely worthless if someone like Lin Daiyu doesn't have one. So as is the case with all great novels everywhere in the world, this scene is deliberately ambiguous. It's left wide open to your interpretation. Now, I tend to feel that Jia Baoyu felt this deep connection with Lin Daiyu the first time that he met her, but then he was frustrated when he saw that she didn't have anything to correspond with his jade. Or in other words, perhaps he felt that her lack of something to correspond with what he had meant something to the effect of, oh, well, maybe we weren't designed to be together after all. Of course, when you think about it, there really isn't anything all that remarkable about the jade. The same goes for Shui Baochai's necklace. Sure, the inscriptions look cool and all, but when you really get down to it, the inscriptions aren't some sort of magical formula or unusual poem or whatever. It's basically just a good luck charm with auspicious text, something that is pretty likely to be a meaningless coincidence. So as you know, there is a literary term for something in a story that is meaningless to the rest of us, but is really, really important to the characters and to the plot itself. This is called a McGuffin. The term McGuffin is closely tied to British screenwriter Angus MacPhail and dates back to the 1930s. It's also very closely tied to Alfred Hitchcock, who mastered the use of the MacGuffin to propel stories forward. So think of something like the Maltese Falcon, for example. Or in the classic movie Citizen Kane, the sled named Rosebud, another classic example of this concept. And Hitchcock describes it best when he notes that the purpose of the MacGuffin is to either start or advance the action. Now, the fact that this term MacGuffin is a 1930s term doesn't really mean that the concept didn't exist beforehand. You have to remember that jargon exists just so we have a shorthand way of talking about stuff that actually exists in the minds of those creative people who write books and plays and whatever else. Now, the truth is that we can trace the concept of the MacGuffin back to things like the Holy Grail in the Arthurian legend, or even further back than that. In fact, if you really think about it, the fruit that Adam and Eve eat in Genesis in the Garden of Eden is an example of a MacGuffin. This is a device, a thing that doesn't mean anything to the rest of us, that really exists in the story just to move the story along. Now, when we think about it this way, Jia Baoyu's jade starts to make a little bit more sense. All the girls around Jia Baoyu freak out when he throws the jade to the ground. This is likely because the jade represents Jia Baoyu's potential to them. The Jia family needs Jia Baoyu to pass the imperial exams and actually make something of himself. But Jia Baoyu, of course, would much rather spend his time flirting and reading love poems than do any actual work. When he discards his jade upon meeting Lin Daiyu for the first time, it's a symbol of Jia Baoyu throwing away his duties in life in favor of the passion he feels inside him. And this is where the key really lies. You see, Lin Daiyu is not just a pretty girl who can write amazing poetry. No, she's the embodiment of a concept called Qing, something that's at the center of Dream of the Red Chamber, and something that was also at the center of the Chinese literary world of its time. Like many other monosyllabic Chinese words, Qing is kind of hard to define. Most people who translate Dream of the Red Chamber focus on the love and sexual desire interpretations of the word when it shows up. However, you've got to realize that it also refers to feelings and sentiments in general, not just love. And so in a very real sense, this concept of Qing represents a direct break from traditional attitudes towards marriage and towards being proper with other people. In other words, this concept marks the literary beginning of China's version of the Romantic era, and this happens a little bit more than a century before it happens in Europe. Technically speaking, the move towards Qing started with the so-called revivalist poetry movement around 1500 AD. As described here in the Cambridge History of Chinese Literature, the idea at the time was to get Chinese poetry back to expressing emotion instead of just following through with convention. And if you spend time reading the famous classic of poetry, you'll realize that Chinese love poems were indeed a thing thousands of years ago, long before the rise of Confucianism. So in my mind, and according to my understanding, this was a natural reaction to the formalism and the convention of contemporary Chinese culture at the time. Or in other words, it's natural to want to focus on love and these emotional experiences and expressions when marriage is always arranged and has nothing to do with romance. It's just about politics and economics and sort of heady things like that. So that's where that movement towards Qing comes from, and it's not really hard to understand when you really think about it. This led to the rise of the Southern drama tradition in the later years of the Ming Dynasty, something that was extremely influential in the development of China's literary culture. And the most famous play was certainly Mudanting, or The Peony Pavilion, a play that remains beloved to this day. The central focus of Mudanting is really a passionate love affair, and its influence on Chinese society at the time was astounding. Again, that Cambridge History notes that this play impacted its fans on far more than an intellectual level. It really pierced them straight to their souls. In fact, the play contributed to the beginning of the so-called cult of romantic love and stirred up natural questions about the role of women in Chinese society at the time. And all of these, by the way, are things we can say about Dream of the Red Chamber, which really has a lot of similarities with the Mudanting. The reason why all of this was so popular back in those days is because this represented an emotional escape for ordinary people. And so the character Lin Daiyu truly is the embodiment of this general idea of Qing, this idea of feeling, of romance, passion, sexual desire, or whatever it is you want to use to translate it. Actually, Lin Daiyu is described in the book literally as being the embodiment of Qing. When Jia Baoyu meets Lin Daiyu for the first time, he sees that she has eyes that are han Qing, or filled to the brim with Qing. It's impossible to translate this satisfactorily into English, so my translation here of her eyes had a dreamy sweetness is completely inadequate. The point, though, is that Lin Daiyu is the embodiment of that popular idea of pure passion and romance, as opposed to doing things the proper way. And actually, the idea that we have these days that marriage should be based on principles of love and attraction is a radical departure from a historical standpoint. So that's perhaps the reason why Mudanting was so popular in the later years of the Ming Dynasty. It was a radical change from the way that things worked. It was kind of the punk rock of its era. In order to explain this, I really strongly recommend that you spend at least some time reading the work of Stephanie Kuntz, such as Marriage: A History. While people certainly did fall in love in those days, Kuntz reminds us that marriage in traditional society was by and large for political and economic reasons, not out of pure passion. In fact, Kuntz quotes George Bernard Shaw as noting that modern marriage happens under the influence of the most violent, most insane, most elusive, and most transient of passions, noting how crazy it is to expect that people will remain in that excited, abnormal, and exhausting condition until death do they part. So Kuntz's work is Eurocentric, sure, but I do think we can forgive her for that. But my point here is that the relationship between Jia Baoyu and Lin Daiyu simply was never going to work, and it's designed that way. Maybe they felt that they were soulmates, sure, and maybe it's true that they did have some sort of cosmic connection, but it's obvious right from the beginning of this book that there's no practical way for these two people to be together. All the signs point to Jia Baoyu being together with Shui Baochai. In fact, if Lin Daiyu doesn't exist, Dream of the Red Chamber suddenly looks like the other run-of-the-mill Chinese love stories from that time. The Caizhi Jiaren tradition, or books involving an intelligent scholar and a beautiful woman, always had happy endings. The point was to emphasize how the scholar made everything right in his world by passing the imperial exams. Jia Baoyu, of course, hates studying for the imperial exams and would rather spend his time chasing after his deepest emotional feelings. In that sense, Jia Baoyu is the inverse of the traditional intelligent scholar from those older romance novels, and he's written that way deliberately. And in the end of Dream of the Red Chamber, Jia Baoyu indeed winds up with the girl that he's supposed to marry, but he feels absolutely frustrated by it. Now, there have been scholars and intellectuals and other readers over the centuries who have concluded that Jia Baoyu needs to be together with Lin Daiyu, but the truth is that he can't. Marriage at that time was not about marrying who you wanted to marry or who you had this like deep spiritual, whatever, heart-filled Qing connection with. It was all about the politics behind the scenes. And that's the whole point of this book. It's the politics behind the scenes that will force Jia Baoyu to be together with Shui Baochai, whether he wants to or not. And so the correct way to interpret this is to consider Lin Daiyu to be a sort of a third wheel. She's a fantastic third wheel, of course, with literary and intellectual skills that surpass every other character in the book. But it is simply impossible for her to actually be Jia Baoyu's mate in the end. Even Jia Baoyu can't accept this in the end, of course, and his life turns out to be totally miserable. And this makes us wonder, would Jia Baoyu have been better off accepting his fate and making the best of things? And so perhaps this is the biggest paradox of this entire book. Nobody winds up happy in the end, of course, but you know, that's fine. Nobody ever winds up happy in the end of the truly great novels. But the question is, did Jia Baoyu sacrifice potential long-term happiness, as in his relationship with Shui Baochai, because he was too stubborn and too pig-headed? I mean, what was he going to do? He couldn't resurrect Lin Daiyu after all. Did that infatuation that he had with Lin Daiyu get in the way of his perception of reality? And does Lin Daiyu exist in order to force him to make this difficult choice, you know, between like the life that he's destined to live and that he has to live and this magical life that he wants to live? I would love to know what you think about all of this.